Of you from Maricopa. Thank you so much for attending this event. My name is Gina Desai, and I am a diversity coordinator here at Glendale Community College. And I am here to welcome Dr. J. Luke Wood to Maricopa. And I just want to go ahead and say that Glendale Community College is in partnership with several other colleges as well. We collaborated with Paradise Valley Community College, Chandler Gilbert Community College, and Mesa Community College, and we thank all the other colleges for attending. We are so excited for this event, and together with the support of our speakers forum, we were able to bring Dr. J. Luke Wood, who is a person that I have admired for quite some time, and we just want to extend a very warm welcome to you. Thank you for coming, and I would like to just share a few things about you, if that's all right. Okay, perfect. So what I know about Dr. J. Luke Wood is that he is a husband, he is a father, and I also know that he is an incredible advocate for students of color. And so I would just go ahead like to share his bio throughout his vast and prolific career. We know that Dr. Wood has amassed many awards and distinctions. He is a Dean's Distinguished Professor of Education and Vice President for Student Affairs and Campus Diversity at San Diego State University. Formerly, Dr. Wood served as the Associate Vice President for Diversity and Innovation. He is also co-director of the Community College Equity Assessment Lab, a national research and practice center that partners with community colleges to support their capacity in advancing outcomes for men of color. We know that you have also come to our campus before and presented to our men of color, so we thank you for that, and we thank you for returning. Dr. Luke Wood has delivered over 1,000 scholarly and conference presentations and more than 150 publications to his credit, including 15 books and 75 peer-reviewed journal articles. And before we get started, we would like to establish just some rules of engagement for today's in-person and online sessions. All opinions matter and are valuable. We encourage our participants to ask questions related to microaggressions, racial gaslighting, any similar issues connected to equity and inclusion. I'm gonna go ahead and pull up the rest. And we just want everyone to be as respectful as possible. This is a very special event, and we want to be sure that you know kind of the protocol for how it's going to be. We accept all opinions, but we don't tolerate any discrimination, bias, inequity, and disrespectful attitudes and language. We reserve the right to ask the participants to leave this in-person event and mute any ones that might be disrespectful, or displaying some inappropriate, aggressive behavior. This is a recorded session, so please note that this is a recorded session. We also have a chat section at the end, and we will be allowing for Dr. J. Luke Wood to answer any questions for you. We thank you for your cooperation in this, and for anyone who is in the online participation part of this, we urge you to ask questions, thoughtful, provoking questions for all of us to think about when it comes to racial inequities. So thank you, Dr. J. Luke Wood, for coming.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for the very kind introduction as well. It's a pleasure to be here and to be able to talk with you about the work that both myself and my colleague, Dr. Frank Harris III, who's not here today but joins us in spirit, have been doing, focused on racial equity issues in community colleges. It is always good to come back to Maricopa. Maricopa is a very dear and special place to me. For many of you, for some of you who may know, I got my doctorate and master's, or a second master's, at Arizona State University, and Maricopa. I became engaged as soon as I got to Arizona State. working with the Men of Color Initiative at the time and providing support to the district as an external researcher. And just getting to know the community, I would say very well during that time has really, I think, been foundational to the way that I think about the issues that we face. And so just know that the insights that I've learned from Maricopa in terms of particularly around what works and what are some really good strategies and practices have been influential in my own development and what I share when I go to other institutions as well. So it's always good to, in my mind, come home. I'm going to basically share a screen and we're going to talk through today's first topic, which is really thinking about how we can advance equity efforts in climates of resistance. And there's lots of different ways in which we can think about resistance. First of all, let's make sure that the technology isn't resisting. Can you see the screen? If you can, just give me a thumbs up. Okay, perfect. Making sure that's good there as well. So the title of the presentation is Advancing Equity in a Climate of Resistance, Aligning Culture and Strategy. And so we're going to talk about what are some of the barriers that we see, particularly at an institutional level, that impede equity efforts as we try to move them forward within our institutions. I am part of the Community College Equity Assessment Lab, that is SEAL. We are a research and practice center housed at San Diego State University, and we partner with community colleges across the country to help understand what are the barriers that face equity issues, how do we advance equity efforts, racial equity, strategic planning, lots of different topics and conversations. And we support colleges in basically doing that work through research that we do, training development, and assessments. And we have been, Maricopa has been one of our big partners throughout the years. And so, and in that work. Now, we're going to talk about resistance, and I'm going to put out a term there that is a kind of a hot button term. So I want you to allow me to explain what I mean when I say this, because you'll hear me reference this throughout the conversation in today's talk. So one of the things that we know impede equity efforts, one of the things that we know impede climates on our campuses is what is called white supremacy. Now, that refers to the beliefs that can be embodied within white culture that deem other races and people as being either less dignified and or less worthy. More simply, it occurs when the white race sees itself as superior to others. So now when people hear the term white supremacy, there's lots of different reactions. First, the kind of mental response is for people to have this image in their mind of people riding through communities of color in the early 1900s on horseback, clothed in all white, terrorizing them, right? And so when I say white supremacy, that's initially where a lot of people's minds may go. And that certainly is a manifestation of white supremacy. There's no question about that. But when I'm referring to white supremacy, I'm really referring to the same kind of belief system, but is much more tacit and beneath the surface. And sometimes people don't even recognize the beliefs that they hold, where they just have been socialized throughout their life to be good people, but as good people to see certain people from other communities as therefore being bad people. And oftentimes we find that those delineations are based upon racial lines and class lines. And when you put those combinations together, it creates some of the more challenging experiences that our students have, but also that our faculty of color, our staff of color, our women of color experience at our institutions. And so when I use that term, certainly I'm referring to the overt examples of white supremacy, but more often I'm thinking about how just that subtle beneath the surface culture that we have can create oppositional relationships for people who come from certain communities. Now, the outgrowth of that, in at least one outgrowth of that, can be negative views of people who come from the Black community. And sometimes that has been referred to as anti-Blackness or anti-Black racism. And essentially what that's saying is that there is an understanding that there's racism, which impacts people of color broadly defined, but also recognizing that for certain groups, the way in which racism manifests can look different than it looks for other groups. And for the Black community, there's a certain type of racism that is experienced, which is called anti-Blackness. And so to think about what that means, we go to this definition from Dumas and Ross, who said that anti-Blackness is an embodied lived experience of social suffering and resistance, and perhaps most importantly as antagonism. And here's the key part, in which the Black is a despised thing in itself, period. In opposition to all that is pure, human, humane, and white. So take a moment and think about, what is the opposite to be pure? It's impure. What is the opposite of being human? Inhuman or inhumane? Or what is the opposite of white, right? And so the notions that embody anti-Blackness are based upon those concepts, but the overarching thing is when Black people are viewed as a despised thing. Now, anti-Black racism is a unique way in which racism manifests in the Black community, but we also know that it happens in other communities as well. In particular, I would say the Latinx community and the Native American community similarly experience outcomes that are very unique and have historical relationships within this nation, which frame how people from other communities view those communities. And we want to be attentive to how that impacts them, but then other people of color as well. And recognizing that these unique relationships influence how we engage within organizations. Now, this brings me to a concept called equity, which I'm sure many of you have heard over and over and over again, but we can never, I think, talk about it enough. And the reason for that is that there's still misconceptions about what equity means. So equity does not mean giving everyone the same thing and hoping that it works. Equity means that we identify groups that experience disproportionate impact, meaning that they have outcomes that are lower than that of their peers. And then we focus our effort, we focus our attention and energy on those groups, not saying that we ignore the other groups, but we're doing intensified efforts around these groups in order to remediate those disparities and bring them up. And if you look on the right-hand side of your screen, you can see a chart. And that chart is essentially, first of all, it's fake data, so don't take anything from it other than it's an example. But what it is representative of differences that we see oftentimes across different groups. And so there are some groups that, if you look at that mean line around 25, that are above that line, and then there's some groups that are below that line. Equity means that we focus even more intently on those groups that are below the line, so that we're being as intentional as possible about bringing them up, because what we oftentimes find is that campuses will approach this work and say, we're going to do a one-size-fits-all strategy. We're going to treat everyone the same. And many of you may have heard the phrase, a rising tide lifts all boats, right? And it's the idea that if we just do good practice, we do guided pathways, we do equity planning, we do integrated efforts, we focus on social emotional development, whatever it might be, right? We do good practice across the board, that good practice is going to necessarily translate into reducing equity gaps for minoritized students. And that is just not true. In reality, what we find is that when you do good practice across the board, oftentimes the students who benefit the most are those who come from majority groups. And what we really want to do is think about how can we be intentional around efforts for minoritized students. And there's lots of different students who experience that's disproportionate impact, meaning they have outcomes that are lower than that of their peers. It can be students of color. It can be former foster youth, students who experience food insecurity, housing insecurity, transportation concerns, employment barriers, students with disabilities, those who've been justice impacted or formerly incarcerated, and lower income students. And I'm sure that you could identify other students like our transgender students and other students who are not, who are experiencing outcomes that are lower than that of their peers, depending upon what indicator that you're looking at. And so ultimately what we want to do is have a heightened focus on these groups to ameliorate outcomes. Now, in terms of the work that I do, I really focus primarily on students of color, but recognize that there are intersections with students of color in relationship to all of those groups that you see there. Now, equity is having a heightened focus on groups that experience disproportionate impact, but equity mindedness is taking that concept of equity and having it change the ways in which we think about the work that we do. And this is a concept that comes to us from Estela Ben Simon, who is a formerly retired or a recently retired professor from the Center for Urban Education at USC. And Estella basically has said that there are 4 different ways in which we have to think about equity for it to change our mindsets in terms of how we approach our practice. The first is that we have to recognize the ways in which systemic inequities serve to disadvantage minoritized people in a range of social institutions and contexts. So it means that we're focusing on systems, systemic inequities, systemic barriers, how laws, codes, policies, and practices over time have served to create outcomes that are differential for certain students. And we also want to recognize that an inequity in one area can serve to amplify an inequity in another area or another sector. So you can think about sectors as education, employment, healthcare, the criminal justice system, and an inequity in one of these can amplify an inequity in another. For example, let's say that you're either unemployed or you're underemployed. That can have an impact on your access to quality and effective healthcare. But another one that we may be even more familiar with is what is called the school-to-prison pipeline, which suggests that inequities in K-12 education, particularly around overplacement in special education and overexposure to exclusionary discipline, that those 2 things serve as the 2 pillars to the school-to-prison pipeline. First, through overrepresentation in the juvenile justice and juvenile court system, and then eventually through the criminal justice system. The second thing she says is that when we see breakdowns in performance, we don't go into that third point, focus on students, their families, and their communities and blame them. But on that second point, we focus on ourselves first, looking into the mirror. What are we doing or not doing that's resulting in the outcome disparities that we see? And then we reflect upon that, reflect upon our own roles in order to be able to hold one another accountable. Now, I'm going to say, emphasize that point here for a moment. Holding one another accountable is not the easiest thing to do. When we see somebody who we see is treating students in ways that are less than what we would want to see, right? Not in the way that is appropriate, it's very easy for us to say, well, that's not my problem, or I'm not going to intercede or pretend like we don't see what's going on to avoid engaging, right? But what I would say is this, is that if we don't hold one another accountable as educators, then we do so from a standpoint of privilege that our students don't have. And so it is a responsibility, it is incumbent upon us to hold one another accountable for these difficult conversations on race and equity. Otherwise, we're allowing harm to manifest in our environments. And then we're not only are we not part of the solution, but we are part of the problem. Now, this brings me to this framework here. If you have seen this framework before, please type and throw it in the chat window. Just say, yes, I have. And if you haven't, just leave it blank. Let's just see if anybody has seen this before, because we presented it in the district a few times and I just want to see. Going once, going twice. Perfect. Nobody's seen it before, except for looks like one person, not me. Okay. All right. So this is a framework that we develop based upon extensive conversations and presentations that we do on racial microaggressions. And so oftentimes I would go out to a school, a college, or a university, and there would be a person who had invited me to do a brown bag focused on microaggressions or implicit bias or racial data fatigue or race lighting. And so there'd be this essentially a person who would invite me in, and I would come into a room full of, say, 30 people, brown bag, conversation of microaggressions. I'd be like, oh, cool, good. You know, there's a room full of people here who are willing and interested in having a conversation. And I would get to the front of the room and I would see the person who was putting it on, and I could see that they were upset or dismayed in some way. And I would always ask, well, why? Are you okay? Is everything fine? And oftentimes they would say, well, you know, Luke, when we invited you, it was because of Jerry from chemistry and Susan from financial aid, because we all know that Jerry and Susan are microaggressing the heck out of our students. And I would respond by saying, well, I have to be honest, I'm not surprised that Jerry and Susan aren't here, because Jerry and Susan aren't going to come to a voluntary training session on microaggressions, because they don't know, and they may not actually care. And so what we want to recognize is that sometimes we unveil these efforts in our institutions, where we're talking about professional learning, a strategic planning effort, an equity initiative, whatever it might be. And sometimes we assume that everyone is the same without recognizing that there are different populations with different motivations. And if we want to reach them, we have to recognize what those motivations are. Now, when we put this framework together, we basically recognize that it comes down to two key points. First, you have to have the knowledge about the strategies and practices that are necessary for improving success for students of color. And second, you have to have the action to go along with it. So knowledge, the knowledge of what to do, the action, the willingness to carry out that knowledge. But we all know that knowledge and action don't always go hand in hand. For example, all of us know how to work out, but we don't always do so. All of us know how to eat healthy, but my breakfast this morning was coffee, right? So we all know how to do certain things, but we don't always put those things into practice. And so when we put that together, it creates this framework. Now, on the top hand side of our framework, you can see a box on the top right hand corner. It says KW. That's for people who know what to do. That's the best group. And most importantly, they're willing to do it. What are some things that we could call someone, a group of people who are dedicated to equity efforts and they're doing the work? Sometimes I hear people call them advocates. Sometimes I hear people call them champions. What are some words? Throw them in the chat window that come to your mind when you think about who those, what we could call that group. One person said accomplices. I love that. Tired. Yes. Change agents. Those are all very good. In our line of work, we oftentimes refer to these individuals as the choir. The choir, they know the strategies and practices. It can all, someone said I get called liberal. Yeah, that's a badge of honor. DEI coordinators, disruptors, lots of different things that have been used, but we call them the choir. And the choir, they know the strategies and practices. For example, they know how to employ culturally relevant teaching, collaborative learning, multicultural counseling, use appropriate disclosing, humanizing practices. They may not even know those terms, but they're doing the actual work. And so they know the strategies and practices, they're doing it. And that is the group that is going to carry out this work. And oftentimes, here's the thing, sometimes people will say, well, we had this voluntary brown bag and only the people who are doing the work came. Well, in reality, the people who are doing the work are more likely than anyone else to take what was learned in that session and to put it into practice. So it's not a misuse of time. It's an investment in those who are already doing the work. You're helping the choir sharpen their tools so they can be even better at doing the work that they're doing. Now, the second group are called the allies. The allies, they have the willingness to do the work, but they don't always know what that looks like. And so oftentimes the bridge between the allies and the choir is training, is development, is professional learning to better prepare them to be able to do the work that is needed to be able to and support our students. And so our allies are critical, our allies are key, and we have to build up their capacity to become part of that choir. Then on the bottom hand side of the screen are the groups that oftentimes stop and impede this work from moving forward in the ways that we really need. So the first group on the bottom hand side is the resistors. Now, there are two different types of resistors, active resistors and passive resistors. Active resistors actively resist. They hear that there's going to be a conversation on men of color or racial equity or implicit bias or ethnic studies. And their response is to push back by sending an email out to everyone saying, don't go, don't be part of this conversation. It's an example of reverse racism and reverse discrimination. They are the individual who will stand up in the meeting and say, we shouldn't be talking about these conversations because this is taking us away from the focus that we need to have on the majority of our students, right? So you can find that these individuals will push back publicly. And I've had a lot of examples in my time in doing this work of actual active resistors. One that comes to mind was a president. We had basically flown to a campus in Arkansas to do a training session on men of color and microaggressions. We were invited by a dean of equity. We got to the campus and we got to the session, and it ended up being a session with 2 people, which, just so you know, with me, I can speak to 1 person, I can speak to 1,000 people. In fact, I just had a session at a conference that they had set me up for. The time got mixed up. I had 1 person, and we had a great time, because for me, it doesn't matter the size, but I could tell that there was something that was wrong. And so I asked the person who was putting on, is everything okay? And they said, yeah, well, the president found out about this conversation today. And so they held a mandatory meeting of all campus leaders to prevent them from going to this conversation. Right now, that's active resistance. But most people who are active resistors aren't going to be front and center and push back. They're going to stay out of the fray. They hear there's going to be a conversation. They hear there's going to be a morning session focused on advancing equity and climates of resistance, and they're not going to say anything. They're just not going to go. They're going to vote with their lack of presence. Someone put they're going to opt out, right? They're going to avoid these conversations and interactions. Now, don't get me wrong, they'll push back behind the scenes, but they're not going to do so publicly. And one of the reasons for that is that some people are more worried about being called a racist than they are about actually being racist. And so that's an important distinction for us to remember, is that some people are more worried about that public perception than they are about the actions that they engage in that denigrate and put down and impede equity efforts. So the 4th group that we see here are those who are the defiant. These are the individuals who they know what to do. They have the strategies and practices, they know the knowledge, and they just choose not to do it. Sometimes it's they've been exposed to this training and these kind of development opportunities, and just, they have a different framework for the world that rejects these notions. They can be people who are part of the choir who became tired and burnt out and then eventually recalcitrant and became part of the problem. So they can come from all different directions, but they are characterized by knowing what to do, but then choosing not to. Now, I had been at a conference with one of the few foundations that's been really invested in supporting this work, College Futures Foundation. And they basically had saw this presentation, and they said, you know, to myself and my colleague Frank afterwards, you know, this is a really good framework, but you're missing one group. And when they told us what we were missing, we had to agree, and we've since added that group and developed it pretty considerably since then. And that's the people who fall in the middle, the people who think they know what to do and really don't, the people who believe that they're willing but really aren't. And we call them the oblivious. Now, the oblivious, they know the strategies and practices, right? They know the knowledge, but the oblivious are in their own way. We see them characterized by 3 different characteristics. First is that they have a savior complex. They believe that their job is to save, not to empower. They think that they have the answers. They're not willing to listen. They bring a deficit mindset into equity work. And one of the most important things that you learn about this work is that it is the authenticity in which you approach it. In fact, one of the things you'll find with students of color, anybody here who has ever worked with students of color, you know they spot phony a mile away because they're used to people being inauthentic. They're used to people being performative. And so when someone approaches it with this savior complex who sees them through deficits, but is essentially pretending like they're trying to serve them, they know what that is because that's what they've been used to throughout their entire life. Now, the second group are those that are non-reflective. And you know the non-reflective people too. Now, the non-reflective people, these are the people who they use the right language, right? They know to say equity as opposed to equality because it has a different connotation. They may say Latinx or Latina as opposed to Latino because it's more gender inclusive. They may introduce themselves using their pronouns or begin their class conversations doing land acknowledgement. But if you look at what they say in comparison to what they actually do, you find that those 2 things are totally removed from one another because they use the language, but their actions do not demonstrate their commitment to the actual work. Now, there's one other group that we have to be attentive to when it comes to this work, and that's the 3rd group within the oblivious, and that's in individuals who are the grandstanders. the people who do this work for the public image and their public reputation. Now, here's the thing. Go back, and many of you may know this, go back 20 years ago, 25 years ago. It wasn't cool to be part of the equity conversation or to be leading the equity efforts. And one of the good things is that has changed. People have begun to embrace these conversations far more since 20 years ago, 25 years ago. But even then, what you find now is that because you can become a person who makes their career on equity, you can be a dean of equity, you can be a chief diversity officer, you can be an academic senate president who pushes equity, diversity, inclusion, you can be a president who's committed to it. Now what has happened is that it's opened the door for those who have an inauthentic commitment to the work to come in, who aren't doing it because of the students, who aren't doing it because of the community, but are doing it because of themselves, their own public reputation, their own image, their own career. But they have an inauthentic commitment. And as I said before, students spot phony a mile away. And so it's about the authenticity in which we approach this work that's necessary for us to do it. Now, here's one thing I would also challenge us to think. If I mention a group, I want you to think about, where do you fall in this chart? So let's say African-American students. Are you part of the choir? Are you an ally? Are you a resistor? Are you defiant? Are you oblivious? Latinx students, Native American students, Southeast Asian students, women of color, justice impacted. Now, I would say this, if you, when I mentioned those groups, said that you're part of the choir for every group, then the truth is you're probably part of the problem, because all of us have more work to do to become the best that we can be in serving these populations. And in reality, we're all over the board in terms of where we need to be. Sometimes we're an ally who needs more training and development. Sometimes we're an oblivious person who thinks that they're on the team, but isn't approaching the work in the right way. And we have to step back and be more humble. Sometimes we're even passive resistors, where we're staying out of the work when our lack of engagement is a contribution to the problems that we see. And so I would encourage all of you to take that honest assessment about where you stand and to start to work to improve yourself when it comes to every single one of our minoritized student communities. Now, I want to just pause there for a second. I see that there's a few comments in the chat window. And it looks like mostly some positive affirmations. Appreciate that. And hopefully this helps to paint a picture about how we need to think about the different people who are within our communities. Now, you might be asking yourself then, if we're a community that's representative of people across all these different groups, how do we get to where we need to be? And I think it comes down to what we call the 4 E's. You can see them bolded on your screen: empower, educate, enlighten, and encourage. And what we would say that is, with our choir, our job is to empower them with additional strategies and practices that make them even more effective at doing the work that they do. Now, with our allies, it's a little bit different, because they are willing, but they don't know what that looks like. And so we need to provide them with professional learning and training and development. We need to educate them so they can eventually become part of that choir. With those who are oblivious, our job is to enlighten them, to engage them in personal conversations that convey humility, because oftentimes what we find with the oblivious is that at one point they were on that equity journey, but then they didn't realize that equity is not an end destination, right? You don't go from point A to point B and you're done. It's a lifelong journey of learning and growing and developing to get to where we need to be. And then lastly, we need to encourage our passive resistors. But specifically, we have to encourage them to care. Because if we can get them to care, then we can get them to employ the strategies and practices that are necessary. But getting them to care oftentimes requires us to go to the places and spaces where they are at. A person who's a passive resistor is not going to come to a voluntary conversation on microaggressions or race lighting or racial battle fatigue or implicit bias or ethnic studies. We have to go to the places and spaces that they're at department meetings, convocation, all faculty days, off staff days, flex days. Bring that conversation to them in those places, and with the focus on getting them to care. Because again, if we can get them to care, we can get them to employ the strategies and practices that are necessary for improving student success. So I see that one person says the oblivious can be the most difficult and sometimes the biggest obstacle. And actually, you beat me to my next point, so I appreciate the alley-oop there. My next point was going to be, we have done this many times with rooms full of people who have equity titles, either chief diversity officers, chief equity officers, deans of equity, etc. And we put on the board all those different groups: the choir, the allies, the resistors, the defiant, the oblivious. And we asked them which groups are most hurtful to equity efforts. And they always mention the resistors, and they always mention the oblivious. And oftentimes we will find that if they have to choose between the two, they oftentimes find that the oblivious are more detrimental to the equity efforts because they send a false message to the community about what it means to do this work. Another person says the oblivious sometimes opt out because they become performative. They have to pay the bills. Yep. Another person said, do you think the biggest hurdle to moving people from one group to the next is the time commitment you have to make? And I'll say this, it does take a lot of time to move people from one group to the another. From an ally to a choir, not so much, but from a resistor, a passive resistor to an ally, it can take years. But I have definitely been part of training and development regimens that have been able to support that. There's one that stands out in my mind, and I've had this happen many times, but this one is more vivid. At college that we had worked with for 3 years, we had done ongoing professional learning, I think about 6 times a year across those 3 years. So pretty intensive ongoing professional learning. And at the end, there was a gentleman who came up to me and he said, you know, when you all started doing this work, I was absolutely against it. In fact, I was an active resistor. And I can't say yet that I'm part of the choir, but I'm trying to be an ally. And I can't tell you how many times I've heard almost word for word that exact same phrase from people. And so from that, I know I've seen people whose hearts have changed, but heart work is hard work, as we all know, and it takes a lot of effort to be able to make that happen. Now I'll pause here for a moment and allow you all to just type in the chat window. I'd love to hear what are some of the arguments that you see, either challenges or arguments that are made to either slow down equity efforts, halt equity efforts, stop them, or even reverse them. What are some of the common things that you hear people say? And I'm going to just give you about a minute or so to be able to type that in the chat window, and we're going to see what some of those look like. And then I'll cross-reference that with some of the ones that I hear a lot as well. So just give you a minute to do that. Okay. All right, here we go. Someone says lack of resources. Absolutely. That's definitely a good one. I'm too old to learn something new. Yep. Sometimes we call that public declarations of incompetence. Academic freedom, that's definitely one that we see, and it's particularly around anything that might deal with pushing back against issues of race and racism. That's been one that in my role as a vice president for student affairs has been, and campus diversity has been a lot that we've had to deal with. I find this to be offensive. So kind of claims of reverse racism or being attacked in some sort of way. Deficit perspectives, are you asking me to lower my standards? Statements that white students are struggling to, they can't be our only focus, which is essentially kind of appeal to focus on majority group. Politicians, my liberal views are just woke and ruining this country. And that usually, again, I like how you use the word woke, because there are buzzwords that are oftentimes used to frame these conversations as immediately being bad. It's offensive to others. I don't see color, which is what we call color blindness, lack of resources. I made it through and no one helped me. Someone gave that one a 100 up. It doesn't align with our strategic priorities, lack of resources. We need to stop focusing on race. These are all really, really good. These are examples of what we see across community colleges. Now, I'm just going to reaffirm some of these real quick. You can see what are efforts that derail equity. Here are some ones that we see that align very closely with what you mentioned already. Some of it can deal with a culture of compliance. Say, listen, we're just doing what we have to do to get the district off our behind or the state off our behind, but we're not going to do any more than that, right? So this culture of compliance, it's only for compliance. A culture of complacency. You know, this is not going to change. This problem is bigger than us. We can never get to the point where we can undo or address the issues that are being talked about here. It can be deficit perspectives that blame students, blame their families, or blame their communities, or say things like, you know, now they want everyone to go right into math, right into English. That's crazy. Some of these students have no chance of succeeding. Issues around lack of data. You know, we have all this data, but what does it mean? What should we make of it? So the data is not being correctly used to inform the conversations. Instability. This is a big one. It is not uncommon for a campus to engage in an equity effort, and as part of that engagement around the equity effort, to have one person who's been central to leading the effort and moving it forward. But then when that person leaves, that person moves on either to a different role or promotion or wherever it might be, the equity effort that was with them that they were part of basically goes away, because it wasn't built around a campus and around a culture, but it was built around a person. And whenever you build an equity effort around one person, then you don't have a sustainable model for the future. It can also be poor conceptualization of equity. People say, well, let's be honest, and someone kind of mentioned something very close to this. Equity really means lowering standards and lowering rigor. And in reality, it's the exact opposite. Equity is not about lowering standards and rigor. It's about raising standards and rigor, but turning that focus of that conversation on the standards of faculty and staff, the rigor of faculty and staff, in terms of ensuring that all students have the opportunity to be able to succeed, which means that we have to have a focus on those groups where we're not doing as well as we should be. It can be siloing, saying, or marginalizing, where we will be like, hey, all that the equity work, well, that occurs in that Men of Color program, or that occurs in the Puente program, that occurs in the Mojo program, whatever the local program might be. But it also comes down to that toxic resistance and toxic support, those active resistors that we talked about earlier. Another person mentioned one that I think is important. I actually had it in part of my slides and then took it out at the last minute just because of time, but mentioned white fragility. Fragility is a very common response to these conversations. And essentially it's when it, according to Robin DiAngelo, a defensive mechanism that's triggered whenever there's conversations on racial equity or racial discourse. And so it's a response that's defensive, that says that, you know, this conversation makes me uncomfortable. And so there's a natural response to essentially push back. And we believe that we can't push back on these conversations. We have to embrace them. We have to embrace the difficulty of the conversation and recognize that it's on the other side of that where we're going to be able to kind of create the environment and culture that's necessary for our students. So we mentioned this framework, the choir, the allies, the resistors, the defiant. That's at the individual level. But we also want to recognize that equity efforts can be pushed back at, even at a broader level than that, at a institutional level. So this is the personal level, but what does it look like at the institutional level? Can you have an institution that, for example, is a choir? Can you have an institution that is incumbent or representative allies? But thinking about that at the institutional level, it's a slightly different factor. We're not so much focused on knowing what to do and the willingness to do it at an institutional level. We're focused more so on culture and strategy. And it really comes from the work of Peter Drucker that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And his famous quote says that culture eats strategy for breakfast. That culture eats strategy for breakfast. So you can have a great strategy, but if you don't have the culture to get it done, it won't get done. Here's the perfect example. How many institutions have an equity plan, a diversity plan, an inclusion plan, an equity, diversity, and inclusion plan, and the plan itself does not get implemented in the way that it is envisioned? And the reason for that is that the culture of the institution is not set up to support that plan into coming into fruition. And that happens all the time across our colleges and universities. And so what we have to recognize is that we can put culture and strategy together and basically we can have that help us think about a taxonomy. Someone said there is no credible commitment. That happens. Or people say they simply don't want to support the plan. That happens. And that all comes down to culture. So what is culture? What embodies the culture? Well, culture is representative of the leadership, right? Is the institution led by leaders who say, this is important, this focus on equity. It is important, it is timely, it is urgent. I have never worked with a campus and had them be effective in reducing equity gaps when you haven't had the president, the vice president for instruction, and at least one board member who basically said, and faculty senate as well, who says that this is important, this is timely, this is urgent, we all stand behind this. Now, you can have success in pocketed areas, right? You can have a program that does really well. You can have a college even that might do well within a college, right? But you will not have a full institution that is successful unless you have leadership at the highest rank saying, again, this is important, this is timely, this is urgent. Then you have to have missions and values that align with that. If, for example, you can't have a conversation on equity, I'm going to throw out some words. If any of these are lightning words or words that create problems within your community, it's hard to have the kind of culture that's necessary to support the work. So here we go. Equity, diversity, inclusion, belonging, justice, microaggressions, implicit bias, ethnic studies, racial battle fatigue, race sliding, critical race theory. If any of those are terms that immediately elicit a negative response within that institution, then that's a culture that still has work to be done. And so that's twofold. Sometimes it's that people who don't understand those terms have been proactive in framing those terms to the community, and that happens all the time. I'm going to give you a perfect example of this. There's a national conversation, for example, that's going on critical race theory, and people who are saying that critical race theory creates an environment where children are learned to hate themselves and to hate one another. That's the exact language that we see used in different states. One governor referred to it as state-sponsored or state-sanctioned racism. In reality, critical race theory and ethnic studies have been merged together to become one conversation when they're two totally different things. For example, my guess is that no one is teaching about interest convergence in kindergarten. And if you don't know what interest convergence is, then you probably don't know what critical race theory is, because it's one of the most central concepts of critical race theory. And so oftentimes these conversations are framed by people who don't have access to the complete information. And so then that's an opportunity, though, for us to engage in professional learning and growth and development, and to embrace these conversations so that we can better educate our campus community, so that we can have the kind of culture that's necessary to move forward these efforts. But it can be beyond the mission and values of the institution into the embedded practices. into psychological climate, into a physical environment that either is a supportive of a culture of engagement and belonging, or one that's not. It can be a faculty and staff composition. Are the educators within the institutions representative of the students that they're serving? And if they're not, then there's more work to be done in terms of diversification. And then someone also said that there are buzzwords institutions use in their mission statements as well. And that is very important. And that is very important. And the reason that I say that is, just because it's in a mission statement doesn't mean that the campus fully embraces it, right? And so that's also an opportunity for a conversation around what values do we believe in. And then someone mentioned that SB 1694 would make it that all the words that I just shared to not be appropriate or against the law. So glad we're having this conversation now. So then there's strategy. So you can have the culture, but strategy is actually a little bit easier, right? It's about knowing what to do and then carrying it out. It's still hard, but it's just not as hard as culture, right? And that's engaging in equity planning, guided pathways, culturally relevant teaching, multicultural counseling, using multiple measures, professional development around equity issues, using equity-minded hiring practices, creating food pantries and clothing closets for students who experience food insecurity, housing insecurity, transportation concerns, employment barriers. It can be promise programs, embedded academic supports, right? So it's the strategies and practices that we know are going to lead to success for our students. So then let's go a little further. You can put all that into a framework, right, where you could have an equity-enriched culture, right, a culture that supports it, or an equity-deprived culture, culture that pushes back. What does that look like? Well, an equity-enriched culture sees equity as an asset. An equity-deprived culture sees equity as an annoyance, a liability, or even a burden. An equity-enriched culture sees equity as attainable, as something that we can do, as an indicator of institutional performance, and as a value. An equity-deprived culture sees equity as something that's unattainable, that we have an exclusive focus on students and their underperformance, and it's not valued within the institution. And so there's lots of ways in which we can either have a culture that embraces these conversations or one that deprives these conversations. So as you look at this, as you try to think about where does your institution fall within this framework around being equity enriched or equity deprived, these are some guiding questions that you can think about. The next one that we can think about is strategy. We can either have a good strategy or no strategy at all. And again, knowing what to do is a lot harder than putting into place, but it's still important for us to know what are those strategies. Well, some good strategies: embedding equity goals into your institutional strategic plan rather than relegating them and separating them out into an equity plan. It can be equity-minded hiring practices versus hiring practices that are meant to produce the status quo. It can be disaggregating data so we can understand which groups are experiencing disproportionate impact, or it can also be avoiding disaggregation because we think that by avoiding disaggregation, then we can avoid those conversations that are necessary for us. And we need more people to be equity enriched, and we need more good strategies to help us get to where we need to be. The sixth one is one that I think is really important here. A good strategy are efforts and interventions that fix educators in the institution, as opposed to efforts that solely focus on fixing students. Now, the reason that I say that is we believe from the work that we do that one of the most important things we can do is focus on ourselves. We look into the mirror to see our own frailties as educators. What are we doing or not doing that's resulting in the outcome disparities that we see, rather than looking out the window into our students' lives and blaming the students, blaming their families, or blaming their communities. And then we can, of course, put all this together to create another framework in terms of how we think about our institution. One that is an equity-enriched culture or an equity-deprived culture. One that has good strategies or no strategies at all. And when we put all this together, we have at the choir as what we want to think about this as the personal level, but we want to become the people's college when we think about it at the institutional level, one that has an equity-enriched culture and strategy to get it done. But too often we find that most institutions don't fit within that because they don't have the culture that's necessary. So they may have strategies, they may have a good plan that's in place, but they don't have the culture to get it done. That's the conventional college because that's the status quo. That's the norm that we see. It can even be some institutions that you don't even have a good strategy or culture, and we call that the colonial college because it's continuing to manifest those kinds of ideologies that serve to create a unwelcoming environment for students, faculty, and staff of color. And then sometimes, very rarely, but every now and then, you'll see an institution that doesn't have a good strategy, but they have a decent culture. And so by happenstance, by accident, they have some good things that happen, but it's the unintentional college. They're not getting there through good strategies and practices and planning and everything else. They're getting there simply because it's by happenstance. And so I want to encourage you to think about this now at two levels. Where do you fall within those frameworks? Are you part of the choir, the allies, the resistors, the defiant, or the oblivious? Is your institution the People's College, a conventional college, a colonial college, or an unintentional college? And it requires us to focus on training for our educators and also empowering our students through additional learning around these topics as well. And then, like I've said, as it relates to the personal framework, we can also recognize that at an institutional level, our institution can have differential commitments to different groups. Maybe we're as our institution that we have an equity enriched culture and good strategy when it comes to issues around food insecurity, housing insecurity, transportation concerns, employment barriers, or even on low-income students or foster youth. But maybe we don't have the kind of culture that's necessary, but we have good strategies around our students with disabilities and those who've been formerly incarcerated. But maybe when it comes to our men of color or undocumented students, we don't have the culture or the strategy in place. But maybe when it comes to our veteran students and students from our LGBTIQ+ community, we don't have the strategies, but maybe elements of our culture or even in pocketed areas support their success, but it's any success that happens is by accident, by happenstance. And so I'm going to just conclude now and take these last 10 minutes before we move to any Q&A, just to say, what are some of the things that I think we can think about in order for us to get to where we need to be? First, I think we have to assess our institution's disposition towards equity. We have to know where are we? Where do we really sit when it comes to this? What is the current status of the equity culture? Where is equity valued? Is it valued in certain places, in certain departments, or by certain people? Is it visible within our institution? For example, do we herald the fact that we're in a Hispanic serving institution? Is that heralded and embraced, right? Do we herald the fact that we're committed to equity, or do we hide it because we're worried about how it will be perceived? How public are we with our efforts? To what degree is equity a salient aspect of our institutional identity? And how can we shift our culture becoming more of an equity-enriched culture? These are questions that I think is important for us to think about, for us to understand, in order for us to be successful with this work. And then once we know that, then we have to start aligning those strategies with culture. We have to have the good strategies, we have to have good culture, and we have to align those so that we can move our institution forward. Then from there, we have to develop a transparent vision for the campus around what this means. Some people say it's actually a Bible verse, right? Where there is no vision, the people perish. And so it's important for us to have a vision about what the future holds for us, where we should be going as an institution. And that involves us being able to have the kind of climate culture that's necessary to engage in these conversations. Then we have to engage in strategic messaging to align our efforts, our values, and our priorities in ways that move forward these conversations. Strategic messaging means that we're coming up with essentially almost talking points or ways in which we make sense of what's going on within our institution. We have to then embed tangible indicators. We have to have ways of measuring our progress. For example, if our focus is on reducing equity gaps between Latinx students and their peers, what are the indicators of success that we'll have along the way? If our focus is on increasing the representation of diverse faculty and staff, what are the indicators that we're going to have along the way? Because without those indicators, then progress will be stymied. We also have to create shared accountability. If there is no mechanism of accountability, it will not happen. And we have to recognize that we have to have accountability when it comes to this work. For example, my institution has been long committed to having an increase in the representation of diverse faculty. For years, we had a program where basically you could have the opportunity to potentially get an additional hire in a department if you had someone who had a demonstrated record of success in doing teaching or service focused on Black, Latinx, or Native American populations. But there was no mechanism of accountability, and so it never served to change the overall density of our faculty. And we averaged 17% of our incoming faculty being from underrepresented groups. But then we created a secondary process where we said every single search has to meet this criteria. Every single faculty member that's hired has to show that they have a demonstrated record of success in teaching and serving Black, Latinx, and Native American populations, every single one. But then we didn't just leave it to the departments. We created an institutional level committee that the vice president of instruction and my office staff of faculty that basically, when let's say that biology goes out for a search, they identify their 100 candidates, they whittle it down to the 15 people they want to do semifinalist interviews, and then they identify the 3 to 4 people they want to bring to campus. They can't just bring them to campus. They have to send those names to a totally separate committee. And that separate committee looks at those applications, they look at the candidates' dossiers, and they determine, do they indeed have a demonstrated record of success in teaching and serving these populations? And if they don't, we reject those candidates and they cannot bring them to our campus. It's a mechanism of accountability. And guess what? Now, instead of averaging 17%, over the last 4 years, we've averaged over 50% of our incoming faculty are from underrepresented groups. Why? Because we didn't just leave it to people, we created a system and a mechanism of accountability. Because oftentimes when it comes to equity efforts, when there is no accountability, the institution's equity efforts will perish. So just some key takeaways for you from this before we move to our time together to hear from you. First, strategies alone are not enough to close these gaps. We have to have the culture. We have to therefore spend more time rolling out our equity efforts and embracing the issues that we have around culture, and recognizing that one of the most important things that we can do to help change that culture is to train people, is to develop them, is to expose them to different ideas, is to involve our students in these conversations. The most equity cultures are inept or resistant to engaging racial issues than they are to other equity issues. And so if you find that you're in an institution that, hey, I can have a conversation around this population, this population, this population, but the minute I mention race, it's a problem, then that's not an equity enriched culture. Particularly, we'll find that institutions have no problem embracing conversations on social class and income status. But the minute those conversations then have a lens that also focuses on issues of race and racism, then that's too far. And we want to recognize that that's not the kind of institution that's needed to support where we need to go. So I've covered a number of different things in this conversation. We've talked about bias. We've talked about white supremacy and anti-Blackness. We've talked about how we can advance equity efforts and climates of resistance at the individual level as the choir, the allies, the resistors, the defiant, the oblivious, recognizing that we want to be part of the choir. And if we're not, and we're allies, that we're going to improve ourselves to get there. And then we've also talked about an institutional framework. So at this point, I'm going to stop sharing screen, and we're going to use the rest of our time here to have a conversation and to hear from you around what you think needs to be done to move our institutions forward. Thank you.
If folks want to turn their cameras on at this time, they can, so that they can have a dialogue with Dr. Wood. I feel like it's always more personable when that happens and we can see expressions and whatnot. So if you want to ask a question, you can go ahead and ask it, or you can put it in the chat and he will answer it for you. And thank you so much for all these words of wisdom you just shared, Dr. Wood.
Do you want me to allow people to unmute?
Yeah, if they have a question. I just feel like when you can see a face, it's nice.
Okay, I can, looks like we have a first question here. I can read this one.
Okay.
It says, what should organizational leaders do? What specific strategies should they employ to combat inequity in their organizations? Sometimes organizational leaders may take action, but solely for establishing a good reputation for their college, and not necessarily because they wish to embrace real change. For instance, during the BLM protests, many colleges put out statements supportive of BLM, but did not follow through with actions. They were isolated statements that were not followed up by actions. In fact, that's actually going to be a big part of my next conversation that's coming up after this is, and that's and actually one of the examples that I have around these issues. So I appreciate that. I mean, here's the thing. As I mentioned before, I've never seen an institution be effective in moving forward these efforts when the leadership isn't in place and on board. And so it's about having conversations with campus leaders. I find that lately, a lot of the training and development I'm doing is with presidents and with trustees. And sometimes it's very surprising how much farther the faculty and staff are on these issues than that these individuals may be. And so it's particularly with trustees more so than presidents. And so I think there's oftentimes opportunities for further conversation. And again, it goes back to a lot of people have heard buzzwords that they don't understand. And it's about bringing in someone who can have a conversation and say, hey, this thing that you think is this big, horrible, evil thing, well, guess what? This is actually what it really means. And it's probably the exact opposite of how you're interpreting it. And I think that that's an important conversation that has to take place, especially given the national pushback that we've seen. I would say that that educators have to be, and educational leaders in particular, have to be dedicated to advancing these issues, because if they're not, oftentimes the performative actions are even more damaging because they can send a false promise to a community that, hey, we're here to support you, we're here to advance this effort. And then the students are like, well, wait a second, I hear the president saying this, or I hear the vice president saying that, or I hear the dean saying this, or the department chair saying that, but that's not what I'm experiencing. And it can actually mess with your mind. And this, we'll talk about it in the next section. It's called race lighting. It can make you begin to second guess yourself and to think that it's about you when really it's a person who's sending false information. And so authenticity is absolutely key when it comes to this work. We have to embrace this work from a true standpoint where we're authentically supportive of these efforts. Otherwise, it's really just a waste of our time. Appreciate the kind comment. Next one. Okay. Let's see. Okay, please address the issue of the fear that causes institutions and individuals to fight, flight, or freeze when it comes to enrichment. So that fear is oftentimes around the comfortability in doing things the way that we've always done them. So here's one thing you'll find. Ask everyone in the room to raise their hand if they think it's important for us to engage in racial equity efforts or inclusive teaching, whatever it might be, to advance efforts for students of color. Everybody in the room is going to raise their hand. Ask them to put that into practice. They'll make a espoused commitment, but if you go and follow up to see what they do, you'll find that that's usually not the case. And that's because people like to do what's convenient for them. And what most people don't understand is that what is convenient for you is oftentimes the status quo and not what is convenient or best for our students. And so we find that educators sit in this realm of comfortability because I'm juggling all these different things, these classes I'm teaching, all this different service assignments I'm doing. I have so many things going on in my professional life and my personal life. I can't really afford to take the time to change what I'm doing. And so that fear of the unknown, the fear of change, the fear of the time commitment, the uncomfortability of engaging in these conversations are all different elements of that fear. And it serves to prevent institutions from moving forward because you have educators with these espoused commitments, but not necessarily the action to go along with it. And so I think that the way to get past that is to demystify what this looks like. Sometimes people think that, hey, in order for me to be good at this work, I have to go from here all the way over there. That's not necessarily the case. It's like, one step at a time, one day at a time, one moment at a time, one new strategy and practice at a time. And it's building that over time to get to where you need to be. But most importantly, as you're getting from point A to point B, it's also recognizing that it's about creating relationships with students that are typified by trust, mutual respect, and authentic care. Trust, the student has to know that that they can confide in you, they can rely upon you. Mutual respect, they have to know that you're down to earth and willing to have conversations with them. And most importantly, authentic care is a shared or vested interest in the student's success, so that they know that if they do well, they get the job, the grade, the internship, whatever it might be, that whatever it is that they're looking for, that you are going to personally feel like you did well. But on the flip side, if they stumble, if they fall, if they miss the mark, they don't get the grade, the job, the internship, whatever it might be, that you're going to personally feel like you did not do well because you're in it with them, because you had the shared or vested interest in their success. And actually, that concept is something that I learned from this system, because I have seen over and over again how students, when they feel that there is an authentic care for them, even if the educator isn't perfect, even if they know the educator is on the journey to try to get to where they need to be, but they know that they truly authentically care about them and they're in it with them, you know what? You might make a mistake here and there, but the students will respond to it differently in comparison to when they see that you are inauthentic or not truly invested in them. And so that's something that I would say just to keep in mind, is that we move forward one step at a time, one day at a time, to get to where we need to be, because the ultimate goal isn't about us, it's about the students that we serve. Someone says, as an instructional designer assisting faculty in course content objectives, design, redesign, I see the resistance. Absolutely. That's something that we have to keep in mind. If you're seeing that resistance, how can we embrace, and bring those people in to have those conversations? Because again, it does change after time. Someone said, yep, 3 years later, you get invited to their ASU graduation. Yeah, that's a good point. And building long-lasting relationships. Let's see if there's, I don't see if there's any other questions are in there. Or actually, no, I see.
Dr. Alexander has a question.
Yes, we have a question, so.
Okay.
Thank you for the presentation. My question may be an impossible question to answer, and I'm not sure, but with full disclosure, I would say we are in a position where we have our individual institutions, but we work as a district. And if our leadership at our district level is not valuing DEI, it challenges a lot of the things that we are able to do at our individual institutions to create alignment. How do you reinvigorate that spirit of DEI or challenge that spirit so that as individual institutions, we're still able to exercise things that align with our strategic plans, even if they are not necessarily in alignment with our district strategic plan? Of course, I do understand alignment doesn't mean we can't do things that are extra outside of that.
So,
don't know if that made sense.
So I've always viewed a system as a district in particular as an opportunity to leverage the strengths when there's strengths and an opportunity to do something different when there's weaknesses. And so when you have a college, the college operates certainly within that district and can leverage those strengths, but each college also can have its own unique identity. And I would say Glendale is very different from Phoenix, which is very different from Estrella Mountain, right? They're all very, very different. Having been to I think I've been to every single one of them, and the climate and culture on those institutions are very different. And so what I would say is that's an opportunity. Leverage what you can from the district, but then the local campus leadership is where we have to look for, and to see the leaders who demonstrate really not just resolve, but courage a little bit. Because, you know, you all are in a and I mean, I was in Arizona. I know that the state, there are elements of the state that's certainly supportive of DEI, but then there's also some political climate that does not make it very easy either. And I would say that because of that, you have to look for those local leaders to take on those difficult conversations, to push forward, even when things seem tenuous and the ground seems shaky. And I know that's easy for me to say and say to you, but in reality, it goes back to something that I said earlier. Oftentimes people will get to the point where like, hey, I'm not going to do that because that's not comfortable for me, or it doesn't make me feel good. But in reality, we have to remember that whenever we don't engage in these issues, we do so from a standpoint of privilege that our students don't have. And we gathered all this information. The individuals who are on this screen today are highly educated. They've all had incredible life experiences that brought them to this moment. And so it's about now taking all of what you've learned and that moral compass that has guided you throughout your whole life and saying, do I or do I not have the courage to do what I have been trained and what I know is necessary to create a better environment for my students? That means that you have to hold people accountable. And sometimes that means holding your institutional leaders accountable, so that if you're at an institution where you feel like the local college president isn't doing what's necessary, it's an opportunity for a conversation. And if you find that they're still not doing more, it's an opportunity for another conversation. And then after that, it's an opportunity for another conversation, because one of the things that I've learned is that people will be as complacent as they want to be if they think that it's a one-time conversation and it's going away. But if they think that, wait, you're not going anywhere, I'm going to have to see this person this day, and I'm going to have to see them after this, and they're going to continue to ask me, and now this group of people is asking to meet with me, and they're going to meet with me this month, and now we're going to meet next month. Guess what? The way that you respond changes greatly as a leader. And I know this from personal experience as an administrator, right? I'm a vice president at SDSU. And you know what? When people don't go away, I've seen it in other areas where I have colleagues who are pushing back on DEI efforts. When you are moving forward that effort and breaking down those walls, eventually they will get on board. And if they don't, then they'll think to themselves, is this the place that I want to be? Now, what we hope is that they will come and be part of the team. But if not, then we hope that one day they'll wake up and they'll see an institution that they don't totally recognize. And then they'll have a very important decision to make. Is this a place that I'm going to stay and be part of this change? Or am I going to transition onto something else? And again, we want them to become part of that change. And we've seen it happen. But if they can't, the most important thing we have to realize is that harm is being done to our students. And we have different options when we think about harm, right? We can either do no harm, which means that we're not part of the solution. We can do harm, which means we're part of the problem, or we can engage in harm reduction. And when we engage in harm reduction, that means that we're pushing forward these efforts because it's not about them, it's about the students and the community that we serve.
We have another question that's in the chat. And this is actually a question that's coming from one of my students who's normally in my class. And I basically asked all my students to go to the second session, but she's here, so I'm glad she's here. What are some first steps we can take to become more equity enriched as an individual? What would be the first step and breaking point, and hopefully will influence the people around us?
So with the first steps that you can take, honestly, is to build the choir. So let me tell you what I mean by that. In fact, it's something I probably should have said earlier. So oftentimes these efforts don't move forward because the perception is that there are so many people who are against it, and there is so influential that people get scared. And in many ways, dealing with these equity issues is almost kind of like dealing with bullying. Like if you think about that active resistor, right? Think about that person almost like as a bully. The bully gets away with bullying other people, not just because the person who's being impacted by it, but because the other people who won't stand up and be upstanders against them. And when it comes to these equity efforts, it's oftentimes the same thing. So what we want to do is to build that cadre of people who are on the same page. So the first thing you do is you start out with the choir. You bring together people for a voluntary conversation on advancing equity and climate of resistance. And before these people get off, you say, or you follow up afterwards, can you give me the names of 2 or 3 people who you know are also committed to this work? And then you bring them together for another session. And that means now we got a bigger group of people. And then after that session, can you give me the names of 3 or 4 people? And then you bring together those people. So it's like almost like a snowball, right? Where you're expanding out the group. But then you use those conversations to say, here are the 2 or 3 things that we're going to do and work on together. We're going to focus on changing our hiring practices to be more equity minded. We're going to focus on reducing equity gaps between Latinx students and their peers. We're going to focus on whatever it might be, right? You identify that, and then you start to educate them so that as you're growing that snowball of people, now you have a bigger group of people so that when you go to the Senate for that conversation, you're not going by yourself. You're going with a group of people. You're not, when you go into the academic department to do training on implicit bias, you're not there by yourself, but you're there and there's people who've been part of those conversations who can help to support it. So it's strategic coalition building with the specific focus on leveraging that network to advance equity. And I'll say this, at my own institution, historically a very conservative institution, and we have been able to make magic happen in the past few years. And one of the biggest reasons for it is this strategic coalition building strategy that I just mentioned. Now, when we go to the university senate for any issue that we want to have a new policy on, we don't go by ourselves. We go with 200 to 300. Sometimes we've had up to 700 students in the room. And I'll tell you this, when you go to a room and you ask for people to vote on equity and there's no one there but the faculty and admin, guess what? People vote against it. When you go with 300 or 400 students, guess what? People vote a very different way. And so that's how we've done it on our campus, is we've embraced advocacy and strategic coalition building to empower people to go to the very place that can actually help them to address the issue that they have. So that could be a strategy to think about within your environment as well.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Alejandra, for that question. Nadine Urista, you have your hand up, so we want you to be able to ask the question that you have.
Well, I think, thank you very much. I think Dr. Wood pretty much gave some good ideas of what I was going to say, but I'm coming pretty much about the same concept that Sharon Armstrong said, asking what are some suggestions to lead those discussions on race and DEI. My issue is I've been doing this since back in the 60s. And so I come from a perspective of a heavy, heavy heart from watching things change to reverting back to the issues that that I, strongly was involved with back then, and it's disheartening. So when I think about getting involved again and being the ally or the voice, I find myself being that person of oblivious, because it just hurts so much to get re-involved. But I think you've already addressed that. But so I'm coming from someone who's been in these issues for the majority of her life, wondering, how do I reinvigorate? I think maybe by reaching out for people like maybe Sharon Armstrong, who's asking to learn to be part of a discussion, but any input would be greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Well, I would just say that you continue to push forward, and continue to embrace the conversations like you're doing. And I would say that you mentioned a concern around obliviousness. The best way to address that is to continue to learn. And the other best way to do it is to look at those who convey like humility around this work and to try to emulate that. Because any one of us who thinks that we've arrived when it comes to this work is, again, usually part of the problem. And, you know, we are socialized to struggle with these issues. That's normal. Not normal in the sense of being good, but normal in the sense of being simply normal and commonplace. And so because of that, it's incumbent upon us to be dedicated to the intensive ongoing professional learning that it takes to really do this work. Now, I will say this, a one-time training on implicit bias, a one-time training on microaggressions is usually a waste of everyone's time. And oftentimes all you're doing is empowering people who are against the work to basically impede it. It's about intensive ongoing professional learning. So think about it as, hey, we've got an amazing group of 55 people who are here. I think we're down to 48. We got a lot of folks who are here. Like, what if you were to say that now this is a cohort that's going to come together and we're going to do, you know, 5 professional development sessions that we commit to doing over the next year. Now that's more intensive, that's more ongoing, and you're more likely to be able to get to where you need to be as a larger campus community.
Okay, and I do believe we went ahead and addressed Sharon Armstrong's question too. And that is the closing of our session. Thank you so much, Dr. Wood. We do want students and of course employees to come to the next session, which is the effects of racial microaggressions on belonging and success for students of color. I always say, you know, it takes a village to raise up our students and we have to completely invest in them. And that is the main reason we called you to come speak, because we know what you stand for and we know you walk the talk. So thank you so much, Dr. Wood, and we will see you in about 15 minutes.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone.